This is Rob Long with Martini Shot for the Ankler. If you have friends who have kids, and if those kids are involved in any kind of group activity, you eventually will have to buy something from those kids. Teams, Cub Scout troops, drama clubs, whatever, they all ultimately have to raise money. And so at some point, a wide eyed moppet will appear at your office or at your door with a half memorized pitch and a complicated book of receipts to manage. I mean, I have bought magazines and Christmas wreaths and pallets of cookies, cheerfully, I must say, though at one point my young nephew expressed frustration with my standard posture in these sales events, which is to adopt the attitude of a very cautious consumer. So, what exactly I'm getting? Like, how many issues of this magazine? How many berries per wreath? What's in those flavoring? Until he finally blurted out, "Will you just buy it? Dad says you have to buy it." So I know all about sales pitches, both on the receiving end and the delivering end. Every job, deep down, is a sales job, and I've done my share of sitting in network television offices with a half folded sheet of paper in front of me. For some reason, I always fold it in half lengthwise with a list of key points I want to make as I pitch a series. And the process is always the same. I tell a little story, a little personal story, something that connects me to the show I'm about to pitch, and then I tell a little bit about the world, the show, and then I give a brief version of the pilot story so that all the characters can be introduced organically. And it's a pretty successful system. I mean, not so successful that I no longer have to do it, of course. I mean, I'm here, right? I'm sitting in a chair in my little house, not in some far off place, having forgotten all about the sales years. But even though the business has changed a lot, the questions from the buyers are pretty much always the same. Inevitably, whoever it is I'm pitching to will adopt the same attitude of a very cautious customer, just like me with my nephew, and demand to know exactly what it is they're getting. How many characters? Are they family or just friends? Where does it all take place? Is it serialized or episodic or hybrid or something else? And unfortunately, I can't blurt out, just buy it. My agent says you have to buy it, although I have been tempted. Walking out of a meeting years ago after a pitch with one of the most successful and prolific TV producers around, as we walked to our cars while doing that thing everybody does after a pitch meeting, how do you think it went? I think they liked it. I think yeah, they seemed engaged, didn't they? Well, but she seemed engaged. He was a little weird, but I think that was about something else. I heard they had a bad meeting this morning, but they seemed like they liked it. And they need it. And then suddenly, this very successful, very rich producer had a mini meltdown. "Why don't they just say yes?" he screamed. "Just say yes. Like everybody involved, just say yes." It was sort of eye-opening to see someone I always thought of as cool and composed lose it in front of his G-Wagon. But the point is, none of us in this business, and probably every other business too, should be embarrassed to be in sales. I mean, we're all making the rounds in our own way with our own little case of samples and products to demonstrate. We all want to shout, just buy it. Just just say yes. But look, the first thing to understand about show business is that it's a really terrible business anyway. In 2003, economist Arthur Devaney proved this. His book is called Hollywood Economics: How Extreme Uncertainty Shapes the Film Industry, and it is filled with a lot of complicated graphs and tables and words like Gaussian curve and fractal, which resulted in my turning a lot of pages in eye-watering stupefaction. But and I failed calculus, even I got the gist. What Devaney showed in his brilliantly unreadable book about the entertainment industry is that whenever studios and networks try to hedge their bets, spending a lot of money on marketing, say, or paying a lot for a star driven cast, they are spending scarce resources on things that don't really change the bottom line. Studios and content producers, Devaney proved, should spend their money on more projects, more movies, more TV shows, more swings for the fence, more chips on the felt, more yeses, in other words. Networks and exhibitors, those are the terms he used. They're a little old, but you know what I mean. These are entities that are not in the business of producing risky entertainment products. And in a similar way, they should do whatever it takes to preserve the widest selection of shows and titles around. So, what producers need to succeed are at bats. What platforms need to succeed is choice, or that clunky, awkward phrase financiers use, optionality. Actually, it is not that hard to fake knowing this stuff. Now, in fact, there used to be federal regulations that required studios and networks to stick to their knitting. Studios were not allowed to own TV networks, and TV networks were not allowed to have a financial interest in the shows on their schedules. And these are called the financial interest and syndication rules, or FinCin for short. And depending on who you believe, or what side you're on, or just how you look at history, they were either imposed in 1970 because of the zealous antitrust stance of the Nixon administration, or because Richard Nixon personally, deeply, furiously, maybe neurotically, loathed American TV networks. They were East Coast elitists, they were Hollywood liberals, and he desperately wanted to hobble them in any way he could. And yeah, that kind of sounds like it's kind of ringing a faint bell, huh? Or maybe there were both reasons were true, but what matters is that FinCin actually really worked. The rules kept the studios focused on generating content and, also keeping writers on fat development deals, but this is not what this is about. And the networks were able to focus on maintaining that thing, optionality. But then FinCin rules were relaxed and then basically abandoned around the 1990s, and that's when everybody wanted to buy a TV network and combine it with a studio, and that's when the word synergy met the word optionality in a dark alley, beat the crap out of it. Also, I think it was 17 years ago, Netflix announced that it was moving into streaming video, and it seemed entirely plausible at that moment that Silicon Valley would eventually disrupt Hollywood. But what actually happened, of course, was the reverse. The disaster cascade went this way. You remember it. Netflix built a fast-growing streaming video business by licensing shows from existing studios. They were mostly reruns for a while. The biggest shows on Netflix were reruns of Friends and The Office, as well as various iterations of the Law and Order universe. But Netflix realized that the minute these licensing deals expires, the studios would take the shows back and build streaming businesses of their own. So they used their popularity on Wall Street to raise pots of money to make their own shows, in effect becoming a network and a studio and a platform and everything else, so that when those existing licenses ended or expired, they would have created a library of shows to rely on. And because Netflix did this, so did everybody else. And that's why things as ludicrous and unnecessary as Peacock and MGM Plus were created. Now, people will disagree with me here, but people are wrong. And they're disagreeing with a lot of complicated math in the Arthur Devaney book. But listen, Netflix was actually mistaken when they assumed that the studios would stop licensing TV shows and movies to their service. Selling content and licensing titles is what movie studios do. It's about the only way they recoup the vast sums they spend on projects and still spend on projects. The top shows on Netflix were, and in many ways, and many times still are, reruns and old movies. I mean, last summer, the most popular show on Netflix was Suits, a legal comedy drama that appeared on the USA Network in 2011. But instead, they turned themselves into a worst of both worlds behemoth, a studio and a network, which, as Arthur Devaney could have told them, was a very inefficient proposition. And yeah, I know they're doing okay, maybe even doing well. But their move was emblematic of a business that just didn't understand itself, which is why we're living in a world where the yeses just aren't coming. And the yeses are still the only way to make any money. I mean, put it this way, when Apple invented iTunes, their online music service years ago, they didn't then go out and start a lot of rock bands. They had an inkling that someone, somewhere in some parent's basement or garage would still be making recorded music. Now, of course, when they kicked off Apple TV a few years later, they lumbered into the studio business too, just like everybody else. But that's the prerogative of an enterprise worth like $1 trillion. Even Arthur Devaney would shrug at that and say, let him spend it. You don't need a graph for that. Now, for decades, Silicon Valley preached the gospel of decentralized distributed enterprise. In the future, you won't need a car, said the minds behind Uber and Lyft. You won't need to rent an office, said the entrepreneurs behind WeWork. There wasn't an industry the people in Silicon Valley didn't approach with disruptive zeal. We heard it all the time. This or that business was Uber for this or that ossified sector ready for a shakeup and an app. But show business had already been disrupted. Show business had been a decentralized and distributed industry since the end of the studio system in the 60s. Modern show business was already essentially a constellation of small entities grouping together to make a movie or TV show, a temporary connection between talent, money, facilities, and someone with an audience to serve, and then moving on to the next project at the next studio for the next network. Show business was perfect for Silicon Valley because it was already Uber for show business. But when Netflix came to town, what they did was they built a vertically integrated old-timey movie studio. They built famous Lasky Players again, or the old RKO, with producers and theater owners under one roof. And they raised money from credulous Wall Street investors and turned a chaotic but efficient industry into Ford and GM and Chrysler circa 1974. I mean, this is actually a very old story. Rational, intelligent people look at Hollywood with its eccentric characters and indulgent egos and barely legal financials, and they think, I can fix this. And then a few months later, after a few glittery movie premieres and the smell of the night blooming jasmine, Hollywood fixes them. And that's it for this week. Next week, who gets the credit? For The Ankler, this is Rob Long with Martini Shot.